I stopped tapping the desk for protected time, truthfully because I don't look at my phone that much trading around. I would hope you guys are okay with that trade-off. Obviously, after a minute passes, you can ask POIs anyway. I hope we were not all reliant on a geriatric smacking the desk. So, with that being said, I'd like to call on the Right Honorable Prime Minister to stand for the motion that states in their name. Here. with their speech call on the leader of the opposition to open the case for the law match. You hear it.
My time starts in 3, 2, 1. Opening government gives us this utopian world in which private companies are going to suddenly act in the interests of the people or of the public. Here on Opening Opposition, we completely disagree with this notion. We believe that the status quo, where public policing is the norm, should be the one upheld. First, on a little bit about what the status quo looks like. 2, on why private companies are likely not going to be, whatever the word is, like private companies are not likely going to be local. Characterization on why they have profit incentives and what this profit incentive actually means for people who are experiencing the mercenary companies. 4, on why there's probably there's less accountability, which will be a direct flip of government case. And then 5, if I have time, resources. So 1, what does the status quo actually look like? First of all, policing is done on 3 levels. You typically have a municipal level of policing. For example, the Toronto Police Department. You have a provincial level of policing, i.e. the Ontario Provincial Police, and the federal, the RCMP. Institutional policing has a lot of checks and balances, i.e. we have things like DEI training, we have things like equity boards, we have things like ethics commissions, we have things structurally in our police systems to ensure that officers are being held to these standards. I'll take you at 4. Ultimately, we have these things, and yes, they can fail, but we're going to prove why government's entire claim is going to fail more than us, and at least we have some level of fail-safe that exists on our side of the house. First of all, why are mercenary companies not going to be local? First of all, in the status quo, let's consider military companies like Palantir or Lockheed Martin. They experience a lot of internal and external investment through things like private equity firms. Why? Because military technology is often something that is increasingly is developing at increasing rates. I think mercenary firms also take advantage of this technology. I think private equity has some incentive to also capitalize on people who are taking advantage of military technology, institutions that take advantage of military technology because it's profitable. Furthermore, if you have government contracts, that's a secure investment. You know that you're going to get that money. I think private equity has the obvious incentive to want to invest in the first place. This means that a lot of investments are not going to be local because obviously it's going to be high level of capital. Developing countries, for example, in developing countries, they don't necessarily have these same private equity firms that will want to invest at that rate. We think that more likely it'll be things like foreign investment that comes in because they want to take advantage of the fact that these defense firms are taking advantage of the fact that these defense firms are emerging and are stable investments because they are taking contracts from the government, and therefore their investments are probably not going to be lost. So we see a lot of foreign investment. Now, on characterization of why these mercenary companies have profit incentives. First of all, how do they get profit? How do they get profit? By fulfilling their contract. What does fulfilling their contract mean? It means being able to adhere to quotas. It means being able to get a certain amount of rest, give a certain amount of people under check. It means being able to prevent X number of crimes. We think these are all statistics these are all metrics in which these these mercenary companies are going to go. I think it's not one, it's private companies are wanting to fulfill. They want to fulfill these quotas to prove that they are effective to the government, right? Because the government is especially the one who has the contract, and they obviously want to show that they are fulfilling their end of the contract. So, obviously they have incentives to make it as cheap as possible. The government wants to buy cheap possible labor. And so why is this an issue? I think first of all, people view crime as rising in the status quo. I think even if crime is not rising, people tend to view it because you see people on the streets, perhaps they're homeless, so perhaps there's thievery, perhaps there's bad shit. I'll take you later. There's bad things that are going on. You tend to view even if you aren't directly proximate to crime, things like the news often exacerbate your view of what crime looks like. 2, people are likely to people in positions of power, i.e. mercenary groups that are now suddenly given the ability to arrest people at whim, are going to be able to abuse it. First of all, they have access to things like highly technical military technology, right? Their police technology. It's very hard to say no to someone when they have something pointed at your face, right? And so therefore they're likely to be able to abuse this power because obviously they want to fulfill quotas. They want to make sure that their company is successful. They're probably going to use the power they have with military technology in order to show that they've been successful. And so furthermore, they can coerce. Furthermore, they are able to coerce confessions. How so? Because when they bring in people to when they have these access to military technology, when they have incentives to get as many arrests as possible, they're probably going to force people to give confessions. They're probably going to treat people bad. There's less scrutiny by the government to ensure that people are treated humanely because they have no access to knowing what actually goes on in the black box of this mercenary company. Yeah, I'll take it back.
All these things already happen in the status quo with publicly funded police forces. What's the margin?
I think that's also untrue. I think there's, first of all, like when you have direct government institutions, yeah, I'm going to move on to this, into my accountability. Political will is effectively the tipping point in this debate. Why? Because governments are going to be held, like governments obviously want to appeal to the people that are there, right? They're quite reactionary, right? They have incentives to ensure that the police department that works under them is sufficient or works well, right? If police are found to be like doing bad shit, obviously governments are now being held accountable by their political audience, and because they have structural incentives to want to win again, they likely want to be able to like appease people to some extent by having their they want to appease people to some extent by having like their own government or their own police systems be held under account or held under scrutiny, because ultimately like they want to win again. They want to go into the next election cycle. They want to have like more political power, and this means that if their police forces that are directly under them are doing bad things and are being doing bad things or being called out by the public, I think the government has a structural incentive to want to like fix this or remedy this to some extent so that they can come back into power again and again. With mercenary companies, because they're private companies, governments can just dissolve contracts and be like, hey, I didn't actually do this, guys. What are you talking about, right? Governments, it's easier to deny the bad things that mercenaries do, whereas with a public institution, it's harder for governments to deny what bad things are happening in the first place. And they have structural incentives to fix this because they want to come back into power. And if they see that people are pushing back against this, they'll want to fix it. They're reactionary. They want votes. They want political interest. The tipping point here is that because of political will, we can ensure that sure, bad things might happen on our side, but at least we can fix them. On their side of the house, bad things will happen. They can just get rid of this company and introduce a new one, right? The name of the firm might change, but the culture does not, right? The culture of quotas, the culture of incentives, that functionally does not change, because I think every company wants to make their investors happy. Every company wants to make the government happy. And ultimately, how do you do this? You like maximize your quotas. You hit these arbitrary metrics, and this is ultimately why like political will is such an important tool on our side of the house, because when we have political will, you prevent mercenary companies from being able to do bad things. You prevent public institutions, or you're more reactionary to when public institutions do bad things because you want to get revoted in. Mercenary companies can just get fired. Like there's no accountability. Bad things can happen, and no one gets anything nothing helped. So proud to oppose.
Let's make that speak for the speech while the Deputy Prime Minister is speaking to the case for the
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, first things first is how this contract actually look. I think Brent Older gives you the frame as to why is it unlikely to be in quotas, but then I think Anya just comes up and completely ignores, like, yeah, we will still do arrest numbers because that's just the convenient thing to do on the op case. I think is uncharitable. I think there's a few reasons as to why it is they're unlikely to do quotas. I think A, it's like paying someone on a point system where if they score more points, you're going to pay them more. I think this financially a bad decision for any government to take. I think this is a bad contract. I think it's easier to give them a one-time payment to give a certain amount of coverage. I think the companies that are incentivized to complete this coverage so they can either renew their contract or not lose out of their contract because they have failed to meet their requirements. I think when you have a quota system in place, I think governments end up spending a lot more. I think no government is incentivized to do this. In the first place, I don't think this is the metric upon which they're doing it. But second of all, quotas are not the only way to be able to judge police effectiveness. I don't think it's arrest numbers or numbers of confessions gone out. I think it's quite easy, especially in the status quo, when there's always so much scrutiny on this being the metric by which public police forces are able to justify funding because they're able to hit a certain number that we're keeping communities this safe, and they're able to point to a certain number, but there's already enough discourse in the modern day as to why it is that this is ineffective because they're targeting certain communities, why it is they're able to pump up their numbers artificially so, and why this is probably negatively impacts communities. I think it's unlikely that governments are then, if they're pursuing private contracts, they're likely to go with this way of building contracts. But second of all, then I want to talk about what exactly changes the accountability. I think Brendan tells you why does it change it. I think currently within police units, even just governmental regulations, I think there's a lot of red tape and bureaucratic nightmare to be able to actually fire someone in the first place, to be able to engage with them. I think there's a lot of process of review. The only reason that George Floyd's murder, for example, was held to any degree of accountability because there was significant amount of like media attention that actually occurs. But still, the daily lives for people in America, especially in low-income communities, is still that officers are getting away. If they don't get that media attention, if they don't get the political will for every individual case, they'll never actually get the justice they deserve because police officers there's a really high burden in the first place to be able to prove that they've done something wrong, that they've gone outside the regulations. I think holding them accountable when A, especially when unions are the ones that are getting involved from the governmental side, B, when the governments themselves are unlikely to do so because they're government employees and probably negatively looks bad on them, whereas their own employees, they're the ones that are acting out negatively. I think governments are then unlikely to like fire and more likely to try and justify and scapegoat other actors on the governmental side when you have public forms of enforcement. Why is it then that the private companies are more likely to do so? A, they don't have unions. B, they don't have attachment to do so. There's nothing like a pension. There's nothing like political will on their side of the house. I think it's quite like on our side of the house. I think it's quite likely they're a lot more willing to just let go of an employee who has performed badly. When they don't meet the expectation or they're actively harming the company, it's easier to cut them loose than to try and keep them and justify it to shareholders or justify it to the person who has now contracted you, or that being the government. I think it's a lot more easier to get past it. I think they have a lot less red tape to do so. Second of all, I think the government is able to hold them a lot more accountable because they no longer have to deal with their own red tape. I think it's a lot easier to either threaten cancelling the contract or B, threaten certain reprimands because as for reason Brenda's law, I told you that's going to be significant oversight. Finally, I think it's also important to note here that there is going to be oversight in the first place. I mean, there's already the issue is the oversight is ineffective when it's hard to take action from a governmental perspective through the bureaucratic nightmare, through all the red tape. I think it's easier on our side of the house when there is judicial oversight, when there's political will and media attention, that they're more likely to just simply cancel the contract. That's easier than trying to fight the entire union. Okay, engaging them with opening opposition, because what do they try and tell you? They try and tell you, A, there's private equity firms that are now going to be investing foreign investment is now going to occur, so you're not able to take control of some other countries' police force. I think Brennan tells you a few reasons as to why this is unlikely to occur. I think just simply when you're in the bidding process itself, I think governments are probably vetting who has what kind of investments. When they see that someone has a foreign investment, they're unlikely to give them contract in the first place. I think governments are probably sane enough to do this. Second of all, even if they argue in developing countries, I think there's a weird West-centric view that developing countries don't have PE firms and they have nothing local, no local investment whatsoever, no local finance. I think it's untrue. I think when you look at countries like India, for example, or even other Kenya and Nigeria, for example, they do to some degree still have financial investors that are local. I think even in these instances, there's still going to be local mercenary groups that can then still be invested in by local investors, and so probably still have local incentives. What does Brendan tell you, and why is this a lot better? A, I think accountability in terms of burden of proof improves on our side of the house. I think on the government side currently, the government has no incentive to improve the current structure because they only have a limited number of funding. I think there's already political will to go against the funding. They can't give them funding in the first place. They can not afford body counts for everyone. They can't afford these measures of accountability that allow to gather proof on if there is anyone misbehaving or if there's anyone who's acting in bad faith or acting negatively towards the community. I think on our side of the house, I think Brendan tells you exactly why private firms have incentives to have the maximized amount of tech. I think they're incentivized to have to make themselves look good in the bid, to be yes, you can check us on all these ways. So the government probably has increased accountability in that way because they can actually gather any proof if there is someone misbehaving. I think so it becomes easier to prove that someone's doing it. I think it becomes easier to fire them as a result. I think it's easier to remove bad actors from the scene as opposed to where you get on government side, where there's too much bureaucratic nightmare, where the burden of proof is too high, when the attachment to people becomes a bit too difficult to get rid of them in the first place. Before I continue, I'll take a POR from closing. Opening. I tried engagement, they didn't take it. Okay, so finally what do they tell you? They tell you that the status quo is enough, that enough political will, because governments want to be able to look good in the eyes of the voters, is enough to get rid of them. I think we tell you the main barriers, legally speaking, to be able to get rid of them, i.e. union reps, unions, and also just significant bureaucratic red tape they have to try and navigate. Even if you do want to do it, it's really hard to do so. I think on our side, that's able to remove this barrier in the first place. Second of all, they didn't tell you that political will is enough to do it, because in the status quo, apparently, the police are this divine altruistic organization who always act in the best faith simply because political will is there to do so. I think it's unlikely that even with the media attention, they can get any benefit on their side of the house. This is just empirically true, unfortunately, as you see in the BLM movement, that in the worst case scenario, when there's only huge media attention, where people are able to actually reverse it. But third of all, even if they do want to defund police on their side of the house, even if they do think there's forms of accountability on their side of the house, I think these forms would like to look in the form cost cutting, for example, and reduce coverage. I think on their side of the house, they probably lose the ability to police properly. They make the trade-off that they're able to hold them more accountable. They probably lose policing capacity. I think on our side of the house, you have the ability. I think firms are going to be competing because they have to give coverage. They have to meet their contract requirements in the first place. I think you're probably getting proper coverage. I think the way in which it's assessed isn't through quotas, but through a more like objective and like holistic analysis as to how it is they're like targeting, like how it is that they're actually policing communities. I think it's unlikely that like on Gov side where they're able to pump up the numbers by going to low income communities to simply get arrest numbers because they can justify the funding because they're doing this X amount of work. I think on our side of the house they're not meeting the coverage. Doesn't matter what the number is. They're not getting paid if they're doing it in the wrong places. I think the government is able to hold them a lot more accountable. I think we have the accountability metrics on our side of the house. I think we have the incentives on our side of the house as to why it is private companies want to behave properly and why the government is able to also hold them accountable, while the government is incentivized to do so. I think on our side of the house, we can actually get changes that probably wouldn't have occurred on their side of the house. For all those reasons, proud to propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech, calling the deputy leader of the opposition, speaking before the opposition. Here.
My speech in 3, 2. I think what Ibrahim tells you is largely symmetrical on both sides of the house. I think the delta in this debate then is that I think the status quo, like there's a structural change when like the prime minister or the party changes each term, right? Like when McCartney gets into office versus when the Conservative gets into office is obviously going to be much different than if it were like the private sector, whose structure never changes, in which they like the only thing they look for in the business in the first place is the profit. I think then when you compare the structure between the two sides of the house, their structure is that the police has to contact the government and the government contact the people. The people gives feedback to the government and then the government gives feedback to the company. On our side of the house, we reduce this distance quite significantly. The police, which is the government, can just, like, the people can voice themselves towards the government, and the government can respond to it accordingly, like reducing this distance. Even if, like, in our worst case, I think there's still going to be, like, a structural change on our side of the house that you don't get on their side of the house. I think when they tell you is that, you know, private sectors have the incentive to like audit people, care about the people, and like they have higher accountability. I think that case has like internal tension. It is contradictory in nature. They tell you that they can fire people at like whatever they want. There's probably not going to be pension. There's probably going to be like shittier pay anyway because the structural incentive is to make as much profit as possible, i.e. this means like hiring people en masse, but like you paying them in like a significantly less wage than they would get on government. And so when they tell you that like, hey, you're probably going to get less stress on their side of the house, I think we tell you when police are taken care of, when police know that like by staying in this force and like they can get pension, they can get proper pay, I think you're probably going to get like much better outcome on our side of the house, where they're not so stressed out and so reckless as they want to claim. I think we flip their claim on this. I think then they tell you that like, no thank you. They tell you that like, oh my god, quotas are probably not going to exist. Why would this still exist on their side of the house, even though it's invisible, right? I think per Ibrahim, what Ibrahim told you is that there's probably not going to be pension, there's probably going to be lesser pay, and now like they can just fire people at whim. I think then, on the structural incentives on their side of the house, is that police force or people who work in like these forces are probably incentivized to make arrests or like reckless arrests to show that they have done something, to show that they have like reduced like, you know, like overdose cases or reduce specific crimes to show their employees that they deserve the mobility to move up in the firm, to get better pay, to get higher pay, and that they deserve even the slightest like humanity of like pension fund, for example. Yes, Brandon?
The RCMP has had scandals of racist and sexist violence for the last 60 years, 15 administrations, and none of them have been able to reform it. Why is it the world where you just fire them better?
On their side of the house, when you fire the company, the name changes. Why? Why is it probably not going to be local in the first place? I think I'll get to this. One is that it's like the burden to even start a company that like has a private security firms in which they can just like do investigations, patrol, have cars, have weapons, have tasers. You need high capital. This is probably the structure then is probably going to be private equity or companies that are already fucking big, right? I don't think they could just tell you, oh my god, governments just take foreign investors, when we tell you on outside the house, why like these contracts are probably going to be taken up by big companies who like have the capital to actually fucking get like the cars, get the weapons in the first place. No, like, you're already taking you. Anyway, I think then, when governments like routinely check on their contract to check how well they're doing, one, I think government has the incentive to care about how it looks to the to the overall global population, right? I think when the annual like index of like crime stats or like drug overdose stats come up, and if it increases, I think governments are probably going to question why private entities are not doing anything about this, even if the quotas are like not stated like explicitly in the contract. I think there is an invisible like incentives for them to do so, for them to like try to look as good as possible to the government, because the government is their customers. They don't want to lose these customers in the first place. Closing.
Yeah, so like, my confusion here is that if the government is contracting these people and then they do bad things, wouldn't then the government also look bad?
Yeah, so the government fucking fired them, but then they hire the same like structural like incentives in the first place. On outside the house, we change because like per like different elections, different people get elected with different goals that they actually have to answer to the people of that country. On their side of the house, the only people they listen to, one, customers, two, profit. They just want to make money. On our side of the house, there's actually a fucking delta. On their side of the house, there's nothing at all. It's just the same incentive over and over again. They don't actually prove to us why their side is actually more beneficial on the long run, right? I think when like Ibrahim like kind of like says, oh my god, the only reason why George Floyd like even got justice is because of public pressure. You'll get that on both sides of the house anyway. It's symmetrical. In order to get changes at all, people have to like actually voice their concerns to the government. We tell you on outside the house why the structure is actually like the distance is shortened, because now you don't have to like have the government as like this intermediary like between the police and the people can just complain to the government and like actually have them taken accountable, like be taken accountable, right? I think we tell you that like the structures of these private companies exist outside of the government. They have profit incentive. The government does not have profit incentive other than serving the people and getting elected the next term. They get paid in taxes. They don't get paid in like the money from the government, which is like still taxes, but the government is the customer of these private entities in the first place. Yeah, I think then on our side out, we prove to you why is probably going to be worse on that side out in terms of accountability, because the distance is now like not shown. And two, I think we tell you on our side of the house why like big corporations should not take hold of like these companies in the first place. I don't think they have any case at all. Thank you.
I think that's because there's each column number go to and the case for the government. Here.
The government is a money sponge. It takes in tons and tons of money, and often because of large bureaucratic barrier, is only able to output a certain amount of whatever they do, like police investigations. And so I think there's lots of reasons why the government is producing or is able to absorb a ton of money, and that money is not translated to actually on the ground change, given the fact that most people still perceive, even if it's untrue, that the world is very dangerous and stuff. And I do think that it's true. It's empirically true that lots of investigations just lose time, or just they get overfunded and they're cut because of budget reasons. And I just think this is immoral bad. So even if you don't believe either front half on the incentives of these police forces, I think we're able to give you, at least government is able to give you a better reason why the incentives are better for private firms. Even if you don't believe this, we're able to win insofar as even if the incentives are relatively 90% good, 10% bad, we get more things done, we save more lives, we do more patrols, we do more investigations, and therefore the margins far clearer on our side. Firstly, on framing, this world has multiple competing firms that are probably going to be fighting for different positions. Firstly, the status quo also already has private firms for security people. This is likely to be expanded into this sort of thing, meaning that if there is competition and there's many different firms, this is just going to happen in this world as well. Secondly, police will probably hire multiple different firms and multiple different groups from different firms. The reason for this is often specialization. Different groups, it's often more economically efficient to specialize in different things. There's I forget the word, but when you put more money into economies of scale, that's what it is. If you have economies of scale, you can often get firms that are able to create certain types of technologies that are able to be more efficient for that specific kind of thing. For example, patrolling, you can be more efficient if you have a larger, more efficient training session if you put more money into that one specific thing rather than more money into technology, which would be more important for investigative police or mercenaries anyway. So you're likely to have each individual police area, police group, hiring from different groups of people, because different groups of people are competing under different ideas. So you're more likely to get more specialization. They also want to avoid being mass leveraged, and because obviously if you're going through all this work to avoid unions, you don't want to have one small company have this much amount of pressure on you. There's also going to be ongoing competition. So in the future, if one company is getting pretty bad at one thing, another company can pop up, and so it's very likely in the incentive of these police forces to hire out from many different groups of people at the same time for different reasons. Secondly, contract period. I think there's going to be a contract period. It's going to be based on the cost. It's also going to be based on past record. This mitigates a lot of opposition's case, which is that if you are the police force, you can still get sued for things that you hire out. Therefore, you're very likely to be able to look at groups that have done bad things in the past or don't have specific regulation. If you really, really believe that ethics committees are important or are really, really vital, you can hire a company that has an ethics committee, and you can have your own ethics committee as the police force check their ethics committee and see if they're any good. This is important because it means that you're likely to have similar values, even if it's not to the same degree of bureaucracy. Thirdly, the incentive to pay for things like body cams are still going to exist because the police has a lawyer system behind them. The police precincts can still be sued for the things that they do. They're going to lose reputation and lose funding. There's lots of ways to punish, even without unions, even if unions do make it difficult to punish, meaning it's very likely police will just apply the body cams that they would have used otherwise on these people so that it's harder to be sued, even if it's economically disadvantageous for these companies, because the police forces will eat this cost and spend. Finally, fourthly, there's an important incentive difference on our side, which is that police are less likely, private police are less likely to do bad things preemptively because of the fact that they can be sued in the future. Given this difference in incentive, it's more likely that police who have the idea of unions or who have the ability of bureaucracy behind their back or of prepaid lawyers that they don't need to deal with, or the fact that their company is not going to lose this contract, they will preemptively be less risky, they'll preemptively be willing to do less things that are bad, which will mean in the first place, you get fewer bad things happening in the very first place. Our case is on efficacy. When you can hire more people with less money and hire better people with less bureaucracy costs, you can get more done, and they're likely to get more cases solved. They're more likely to keep more communities safe. Police incentives are poor, and so yeah, we already explained that. Next, on the case. Why does private policing cost more? Firstly, there's a monopoly on governments. There's union laws and incentives of these unions to prevent more people from being hired in order to keep wages high. There's a high retirement payout. Police and government workers are paid incredibly high for lots of reasons, but this also means that it costs more per person to hire more people. There's very few audits, right? Because people just generally value job stability. People have an incentive to say, hey, we want to maintain police for as long period as possible. We want to maintain their job stability as much as possible. Therefore, we're not going to threaten their jobs in any meaningful way. There's no price competition. There's no incentive to innovate in any different way. There's lots of regulatory regulatory bloat that exists in all worlds just because of decades of regulation it's often very easy to create regulations. Nobody's really fighting for regulation decrease because the government is not a capitalistic entity, and therefore if there's regulation that is unnecessary, that is no longer serving a purpose, that is outdated, this is very likely not going to be removed because there's no single private entity that's going to be fighting against this. And given that the police system has been existent for like decades and decades and decades, over 100 years, there's tons of regulation that still exists, like writing tons of reports that don't need to exist, ethic committees that are incredibly large that only need to be large in certain precincts rather than others, and lots of other bad things that are really bad. There's also incredibly high barrier to entry, which means that if anyone else wants to compete against the police in any meaningful way, even like a small security way, it's very difficult to do so because the police are like literally free. You can't do this. You can also get sued, so you don't want to do this. There's incentive to reduce. That's what it is. Privates cost less. The incentive to compete per firm. Firstly, lowers costs, has lower regulation because these places are not as regulated as the police precincts are, and there's more innovation, there's more technology that's checked faster. Even if there exists more technology, I think it's also more likely to Texas. First of all, they're more likely to adopt this technology because they have a price incentive behind them. They want to reduce as much as possible in order to be the highest bidder, the lowest bidder with the highest output for the police in order to get hired in the first place. So there's incentive to do this. But secondly, this doesn't mean that standards get crazy low. The incentives are people are generally, police are probably bad on either side, but it's probably better because you can't be fired on our side, and people are preemptively less risky, which is generally good. You also are likely to train your people to follow reasonable legal regulation because you don't want to lose your contract, you don't want to fire your person. The individual person can also be fired, which is not something that can be said on the other side. The entire contract has a massive incentive to enforce this kind of regulation because if they lose their contract, they're cooked for many, many months. They're going to lose one of their major people that's like funding them, and there's lots of other companies that are able to take up their mantle in the counterfactual. Right? Competition is not just the lowest price, it's also the highest quality for that price. There's probably a minimum standard price that police are willing to give because there's a massive public incentive for high police money, right? You want to like keep your city safe. This is a really good thing that politicians have a big incentive to say to their people, hey, we're going to fund your police system. And so it's likely you're going to have very large budgets. And so, even if you want to undercut that a little bit by a private company, the ability for efficiency is incredibly through the roof. It also means that there's large incentives for this budget because of the narrative of stuff. You can also hire people on the edge of hireability. So ex-cops or people who are security or people who are on the edge of getting into cops but don't quite qualify, these are people who are willing to be hired on our side that you can't get. There's way more people who are willing to take this job in the first place who are broadly qualified but we don't get otherwise. Hamza will explain the impact. Thank you.
Let's make that speech on member opposition to speech for
non-verbal POIs, please. Policing is meant to serve the good of the community, promote safety and order, and trust in the authorities that govern these values. What we do by corporatizing these values negatively impacts all parties involved and ruins community relationships. On this basis, so very proud to oppose. So a few main things in my extension speech for you today. First, a thorough refutation of everything we've heard from front and back half government before I get into my own extension and some weighing on why we take this round. So first, let's get into some refutation. So like front half of like government mainly comes up and addresses all these like critiques of the police system. But a few responses to this. One, premium for services as opposed to arrest numbers. All of this actually doesn't do anything to change the motivations of the actual company. Sure, the company might not be making profit like per arrest, but they are still going to only be making profit as long as they are seen as necessary on a certain scale to maintain safety in the community. Like more about this like later in my speech as well. Second, police are less stressed making fewer snap decisions to the point that we hear out of them. I argue that this responsibility just like shifts to the company. If anything, a company built on profit as opposed to like a police union building relationships on goodwill has more of an incentive to cover up actions within the company or to be able to maintain a PR curated image. While I think that the foreign investment capabilities of like third world countries like India, Nigeria that are mentioned are important, I don't think that on a practical scale they are the most relevant. If a security company exists in like rural Saskatchewan, I don't think that the most like accurate characterization like is going to be like the main harm coming from this like is like going to be people in a different country like investing in this security firm. Second, from the back half of government, we hear about like how competition equals growth, competition equals better quality. One, police technology does require money. This is something we hear about in front half as well. However, in the same way that these companies are able to eat these costs up front, I think that policing also has like I think regular policing also has like governmental contracts and like systems that allows them to do these things. Additionally, the reallocation of these resources across police departments is much more appropriately managed. For example, if one police department has no cases, they don't need equal resources to a high crime neighborhood, and current policing systems allow for this like centrally regulated system that like allows for smooth distribution of resources that I think is more like important than just having like the largest company be able to like just ramp up resources in like rich communities. I don't think this is like as equitable. Next, many different groups of people can be hired. In something that should be as like consistent as policing, I would argue that the more parties that are actually involved in enforcing the law introduces more subjectivity. It introduces less accountability because it's just like all over the place, right? Like there's no like place where you can directly like point your fingers to if you're just like having like all this competition fill the gaps like they claim. Preemptively, it's not likely that private policing is going to cause more responsible decisions. If anything, I think companies have like more of a collective brand image to maintain than like individual police officers like acting out and having to be like defended by the union. Officers who do make bad decisions on their side of the house are likely to have more coverage because they have to again maintain this curated brand image. Now let's characterize what is actually likely to happen under the mercenary police model. In status quo, law enforcement officials are praised when they create safe neighborhoods. There's an incentive to promote this that stems from the best interests of neighborhoods, of citizens around them and the expectations that these citizens hold. We think that opening opposition touches on quotas being met as an obligation under the mercenary model, but we are willing to give government the grace of assuming that this is symmetric on both sides of the debate. More importantly, the tipping point happens when the mercenary model corporatizes this relationship. A demand for their business model only exists as long as there are feelings of insecurity. What are the impacts of this? One, the primary priority becomes shifted from safety to creating an illusion of like unsafety for like the need of this corporation. Two, the lack of trust between many marginalized groups and police officers becomes exacerbated as there is more of an incentive for officers to create illusions of insecurity that often target already stereotyped groups. When the relationships between enforcement officials and citizens as well as citizens and other citizens shifts, it creates environments of hostility that distance the community from each other and further reduces the trust and the motivations of law enforcement officials. Second, we think that this improves equitable distribution of enforcement, as we talked about earlier. When the government is able to keep centralized records of various local communities and how they're able to distribute forces and resources based on like whether a community is more deemed less or more dangerous, we think that they are able to offer resources to help this. So for example, the educational and opportunity programs that local RCMP chapters are able to offer that is focused on ground-up initiatives as opposed to just like solely law enforcement, we think this is unique to our side. Now, why does this extension overweigh everything else that we have talked about in this round? All sides tell you that we get non-local and profitable investment in security companies. While we do think foreign investment in government are like important things to consider at the end of the day, the government does have the onus of signing this contract. And like, even if the direct accountability doesn't fall on them because they like have some sort of effort to like align their, I'll take you in a minute. Even if the direct accountability does not fall on them because they have the company's like image to fall back on, we think that the government will still make some sort of effort to like align their image with that of the company. We think it's more likely that this lack of transparency that arises because the government and this like contract company are working together and like this image being of utmost priority to the government and the company is going to like results in damaging of relationships within the community because it's obvious that transparency is not actually the priority. The government wants to get reelected, the company wants their contract renewed. This like relationship is what's taking priority. Yes.
I think to extend to self-defeating, taken at its best, if it is that like a company makes people feel unsafe and feel like this crime, they're going to report to the government who's going to fire them. I don't think this actually generates demand for the company, generates some profit. I don't think they'll do it.
Yes, but again, this like goes like I think like front half also addressed this, but like if the government is going to like just like keep firing all of these companies, this makes the government look bad too. Again, like they want to get reelected, they don't want their citizens to just be like, oh, like we're just like hiring a bunch of like shitty communities. The goal of this like company is to be like, oh, it's actually really unsafe here because of like these like reasons, but then like because we're here, we're making it a safer place, and that like image is what they're trying to maintain is like our point of the argument. In terms of government, we're able to show you how like we improve conditions for vulnerable sectors in the community, we're able to redistribute resources from a more equitable standpoint and create tangible change that isn't centered around image, but rather on like ground up relationships within society. So proud to oppose. Thank you.
like to think that speaks to their speech on government ways, which is really for the government that you hear.
I would like to record my speech. Or, I'm sorry. I don't know. 3, 2, 1. Lots of crime goes unsolved. Lots of people don't get the recess and justice that they need because public cops kind of suck. The first thing I'm going to do is fill in what Nitin actually told you to open a government, then deal with the op bench. Firstly, what does OG tell us? They talk about, generally that cops are going to not be held accountable on their side, even if they're going to be bad actors. Firstly, why is our extension novel? Nitin tells you the competition mechanism in our framing. When you have different firms competing against each other, this lowers the cost for the government. Modern policing is incredibly expensive because you have to deal with things like, unionizing cops, high retirement payouts, they pay really high salaries, overtime, the dangerous work, etc. These kinds of things mean that public policing is going to be relatively expensive. Why does this then not happen on our side? Firstly, competition would mean security firms are incapable of going unionizing specific cops because they need to get this get lots of equipment, right? So the kinds of people that they're going to hire initially, especially as capital, are probably going to be ex-military, ex-cops, right? These kinds of people are going to cost a decent amount, but then also they can't just suddenly unionize these people given that they don't have nearly as much capacity as the public police force does. But the problem with the public police force is that the state has complete monopoly on violence, right? So they control entirely what happens and how crimes are then going to be solved on their side. So the problem this creates in corrupt areas where there's a lack of trust in specific institutions, there are fewer checks and balances on the cops, and so people are going to be more fearful on the streets given that they don't believe in the cops in the first place to solve these problems. So then why is public policing bad? Different departments needing to cooperate with one another, you get things like hiring issues. One, you can't hire an intelligence officer or a detective immediately. They need years of service. With the police department, they need to be of a specific rank. These kinds of things matter to when hiring higher level cops, right? But secondly, comparatively on our side, you're likely to be more efficient. For example, instead of going through 6 months of training at a camp far, far away from home, having citizenship and residency checks, you need to do far fewer checks to hire people. So it's easier to hire people en masse. So you can get rid of people, hire people more effectively, even if you so you can afford those kinds of turnover costs, right? So comparatively, these are these are contracted out to the government, and you're still likely to get the same amount of public scrutiny given the POI that we gave you. Fourthly, OG tells you that it's easier to get rid of bad actors. What we are going to tell you is why there's less political will for really intense crimes. OG tells you is that if you have bad actors, private security firms are just going to get rid of them, right? Here's what we are going to tell you. The kinds of people who will enter public police are going to be bad actors in the first place. Why is this the case? 3 reasons. One, the position of power and authority typically draws in, narcissists and people who want to engage in some sort of violence. They like power. Now, this exists symmetrically, so the kinds of people are going to act out. But on their side, the problem is that given that on side of public police, given that we already know that the public police is likely to keep you protected, the kinds of people that are likely to enter public police are more likely to be narcissists, given that they feel like they're going to get this kind of protection. Secondly, given that public police, protects police officers, and they won't easily fire them, this conversely means that every police officer who now works for the public police now has greater capacity to do bad things like police brutality. So note, OG tells you you don't hold bad actors accountable. What we specifically tells you is that you get more bad actors for public police in the first place. Right? Thirdly, governments want to keep these contracts because it looks bad if they hire bad contracts. To wash this out from CO, bad actors are actually more likely to exist in public policing, and so governments will still care. So even if you get more bad actors existing in public policing, given that they're less likely to be fired, and you're likely to get those kinds of people, and so you get given that they, or for example, if I'm a cop and you do things like police brutality and shit. You're more likely to do it under public policing. Yeah, I'll take the POI.
Do you think you're going to get more accountability when a union holds a bad cop accountable, being like, oh, okay, like sure they're one of us, but they like did this thing and like they're okay, like we're calling them out on it, or do you think you're going to get more accountability from a company trying to maintain a brand image?
I think, okay, I'll deal with your brand image point firstly. I think that the government probably still cares about its brand image symmetrically. And so if you have public policing and the cops are still bad, your brand image is still going to be affected. So you don't actually prove a margin on that side. But also, public policing has cops that are going to be, the complete job security and unionization is bad and far less affects the scrutiny, right? The most important thing in this round should probably be how effective they are at solving these crimes. This looks like taking many, many years investigating a murder crime because not enough political will exists to solve that crime because a lot of cops end up being lazy in the first place. So you then have less political will to actually do things like investigating really, really difficult crimes. So the impact of this is that we massively win on magnitude, given that the mercenaries are far more likely to be efficient. This is also really good for rural areas that can't really afford, like a really massive public police department. They can contract out more effectively because of the competition mechanisms that Nitin has already given you. Okay, firstly, on CO. CO tells you that you're going to reallocate, the reallocation of resources is going to happen, it's going to be appropriately managed. Firstly, our framing allows for maximum efficiency given that we can contract out to specific firms who deal with specific tasks. Why is this likely to happen? In our world, what this means is just that giving one security firm complete leverage is probably not something that the government wants, right? Typically, the government's not just going to give a complete monopoly on violence to just another company entirely, given that this would mean that the company is going to have a lot more leverage. So the government is likely to give out specific tasks to specific companies, and the reason this is going to happen is that those specific companies are better at managing specific tasks, so those companies have an easier time. They can hire specific people who are better at patrolling, who are better at investigations, etc. So these kinds of tasks can then be divided, and so it's easier to gather that kind of information easier, right? So cops can hold a security firm accountable as well. For example, officers who do well within a company can threaten to leave or sue them and have greater amounts of public accountability that can exist, whereas it's far more difficult under a public police service. So these illusions of insecurity are going to be symmetric given other reasons for why people are still going to be feeling unsafe, right? So if you live in a really high crime neighborhood, people will probably still feel relatively unsafe. But then aside from that, there's like media reporting on criminals and the way certain media might work. Lots of people watch like movies and TV shows on the way specific things, on the way crime works. People still fear crime on that side. But your friends and family talk about things like crime as well. I don't think that these companies are going to create this illusion of insecurity to cause more people to be fearful of the streets. So the last thing on the image being important to the government, the government can get rid of them, but also generally the government is not going to keep a bad actor keep a bad actor or a bad contract keep going because it affects their reputation as well. So throughout a period of time, if a government has a bad contract, they will get significant amounts of public scrutiny. I think the public scrutiny would then mean that the government is going to remove that bad contract anyway. So all the image stuff that they are going to talk about is far less likely to happen. Even if the government doesn't want to look bad that they're constantly switching contracts, this is less likely to happen, given that the government is probably likely to do a lot of checks and stuff to make sure that the kinds of people that they are hiring are going to be relatively effective. With that said, what we are going to get is a lot more crime that is then going to be solved more effectively. On their side, you are likely to get more police brutality, given that the officers feel like they can take higher risks because they are held less accountable. With that said, proud to propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for your speech. Call on the opposition whip to conclude the case for the opposition bench and the Alright, so, yeah, we have everyone here, we're not missing anybody. Cool, so, thanks for debating, just going to call briefly and not why. So, call for arms as follows. First to opening opposition, second to opening government, third to closing government, fourth to closing opposition. So, OO, OG, CG, CO. Let's try to apply. So, what do I get in front of? From opening government, I get a case which is as follows. First, there's some modeling, just to say that, well, first of all, we would probably try to limit the amount of police brutality that exists because people don't really like it, so we would try to contract firms that do it. As a result, we would also probably frame this as like insurance, where you are paying for general coverage of an area over a long time period. You may not necessarily be paying them by arrest. As a result, the government argues that because government incentives align in such a way that they A, probably don't want to hire foreigners because of national security risk, and two, because they generally want to have a regulated police force, we probably will have some regulations in place. Opening government from here argues the following. That basically, this just generally may lead to some level of better accountability. The argumentation is as follows. First, that, well, you may get better police accountability because police unions are bad, and as a result, private companies may just be more willing to, one, union bust, and as a result, fire unruly employees who do police brutality, which in turn means that you have some mechanism of removing bad cops. Secondly, they argue that, well, you also may get better accountability because the profit motive operates in such a way that they are going to want to be somewhat transparent with how it is that they operate. And as a result, you also just may have better training for how it is that firms work. There's also argumentation in the bench about how it is that this is going to lead to a better expenditure of money because policing is currently incredibly expensive, meaning that where governments may not want to overspend on police in fear of public backlash, opening government argues that this will lead to a decrease in the backlash that exists and policing spending is necessary. By contrast, the case they get from the opening opposition is as follows. That in order to get profit, a lot of these firms are going to have to justify their perpetuated existence, meaning that they're going to have to, one, get arrests in order to show to the government that they're going to actually be worth continuing to contract. Two, they argue that they're going to have to make this as cheap as possible to justify continuing getting a contract such that it is cheaper than pre-existing services that exist. Which opening opposition argues from here is that, one, it means that you're going to have bad arrests because people are going to be acting, one, with relative amounts of fear. They are afraid they may get fired, they don't have much to be able to land back on because they don't have high wage, they don't have pension, meaning that they kind of want to make sure that they don't lose their job. Secondly, they argue that this has less accountability. The reason being is that, one, private firms can simply be brand. It's not clear that you have to be the same name over and over, that you just close a shop, open up under a different name, make it seem that things are a lot better. Secondly, they say that you're going to have lesser accountability because when the government is the customer, they only really have an interest in doing things that the government wants them to do. They don't necessarily have an interest in doing what the public cares about, like contracts with the opposition outlines. The public does have some level of direct accountability, and as much as if the government is doing a bad job with regards to the regulation of policing, you can simply vote for a different politician or set of politicians who wish to operate policing in a way that is different or more in line with what the public wants, and as a result, you are going to get better outcomes. Lastly, opening opposition argues that when you have worse pay to be able to get more profit, you also just end up, you end up having more stressed cops who possibly are worse at their job. Why does this lead to opening opposition beating up over opening government? My reasoning is as follows. First of all, I think that opening government rests on a set of assumptions that are just very unproven in this field. That is to say, a lot of the claims about why it is that private incentives are more in line with acting peacefully without violence against the public are assertions, right? They're claiming that it is cheaper for the police to do more training of their employees such that they are going to not act in such a way that they are violent. I'm not sure why this is true. Both in the sense that I'm not sure why it is cheaper to do them, nor is it clear to me why it is that companies have a greater incentive to reduce backlash on accounts of police brutality than the government does, right? It is equally the case that I'm not really sure why it is that private policing organizations have a greater incentive to spend on high levels of technology that can be used to police the public that the government doesn't have, and we also all agree we live in a world where the government does this already, right? The regular mentions from the opening government, but the extent to which the police do these things in status quo makes it clear that it's not, I'm not sure why the private market has all of these different incentives. Additionally, when it comes to unions, a similar thing arises as well. While I'm convinced that private markets have a lot of unions and hence they can be more willing to be busted. I'll give you that much, but what I'm unsure of is why it is that, for example, the alternative where companies are going to fire their lowest ranking employee rather than protect them and insulate them from lawsuits is true. The extent of this explanation is, well, other types of companies do this, i.e. Citibank, which, while obviously true, that is what Citibank does and other banks do, what's unclear is why that's analogous, right? Now, why is it that the actions of Citibank, right, are the same types of incentives at play than a policing service, right? There very likely are different incentives at play, given that they operate in completely different environments and marketplaces when it comes to what they view as an ideal form of protecting themselves, that it's not clear to me why that analogy makes it such that I have to believe that this is the case. Meaning that while I can accept that we might have fewer police unions and that prima facie is probably preferable to some extent, at least in terms of there being a lesser clear mechanism of racketeering amongst the police, it is not clear to me what the countervailing incentives are that lead to there being a general increase in police accountability. While I will say that opening government's regular mentions of how status quo is an abject failure are like based and true, it still doesn't do enough to do the countervailing analysis about why those incentives are better, right? To stop talking about the debate in particular for a second, if we in this debate seemingly are all going to agree that policing as an institution is dubiously evil, we could just genuinely be talking about two evils, right? So even if you point out regularly via POI that the police are the devil, it's not clear to me why it is that private policing aren't the devil, right? So yes, you can get credit to some extent for pointing out that status quo hasn't worked, but that only shows that you can mitigate the best case scenario for opposition, but it doesn't, by contrast, prove your side as being any better, right? So it kind of makes that difficult for me to say that while I can accept that we may have fewer unions, it's not clear to me why it is that there wouldn't be this racketeering group to protect themselves, why there wouldn't be efforts to leverage the government into prioritizing the police, why there wouldn't be interests to engage in hostility and stuff like that. A lot of these things I think are improvable. By contrast, well, I think that opening opposition does have quite a few gaps in this regard as well. At the very least, what opening opposition is able to outline is one, a slightly more coherent mechanism for accountability. Why? Because if an opening government claim is profitability, what I need as an explanation is why an instance of police brutality would actually be something that the police find to be unprofitable on your side of the house. Why is it that a police acting in a brutal, violent way is something that would lead to their stock price fall, right? It may be one of those things that, like, hopefully in this debate we all think is true, but I'm actually not fully sure it is. I'm really not fully convinced that, and I'm not saying this like Ethan's personal political takes, but my point is to say is like, it is not clear to me why it is that if everybody in agreement in this debate is, oh, they're going to have a 3-year contract to serve and protect a particular environment, right, like a particular town, and then one officer beats someone unjustly, it's not clear if they have a guaranteed contract for 3 years, and this happens 6 months in, what is the harm to that company's profitability? I'm not using this to be overly harsh to you guys, but my point is that if your claim is profitability leads to more accountability, I need an explanation as why this does decrease profitability. The claim is it does because companies don't like that perception, and while I can accept that that's true, opening opposition's analysis is that one, the public doesn't like the fact that they are being brutalized, and thus they ask the government to do something better, and government officials themselves might not like that their administration is acting in this way, and as a result, when you have two different types of incentives at play that are a bit more direct in terms of their relationship to who is making decisions within the police about how police are going to act, there's at least a clear, better reason, or slightly preferable reason, for why it is that you may get accountability, where by contrast, it's not clear that we get that with government. Secondarily, I think that these analyses about how the police are going to get paid less under your side of the house because we busted the union, I do think is, I'm not going to say entirely flipped in opening opposition, but I do think is weaponized against opening government effectively. Where opening opposition is able to explain that, one, these people now don't have much money, don't have a particularly high pension. They say that means that they may have to act recklessly to try to get promoted, to signal that they are worthy of moving up the ranks, that they want that to be able to get job stability. Well, I don't think that this is fully proven in opening opposition, because opening government equally can say, well, we might just fire people who are bad at their jobs. It is still seemingly the case that people who are underpaid and stressed about their future may act irrationally, right? And that is a genuine risk in terms of their behavior. So while I don't think that opening opposition fully proves that we are systematically going to get worse outcomes on their side of the house, the very fact that these officers are more stressed and more on the margins in terms of their job stability does represent a new risk that previously we all accepted may not exist. Lastly, opening opposition's claim about how it is that the government is now compliant in this regard and how that creates perverse incentives for these firms. Well, I think that opening government does a noble job in trying to frame these out around by your modeling about insurance, about how you may not require quotas. I do think that opening opposition does develop a bit of a margin here, which is that these firms, while they may not have explicit quotas, do need to justify their existence. And the way they justify their existence is by showing that they were able to get more arrests maybe than the police were able to do before, or limit crime in some way that the police weren't able to do before. And the opening opposition argues that to some extent that does look like being a bit more harsh on the community than they had done before. And also when you're doing it for as cheap as possible, you often end up cutting corners. And while I think opening opposition would do a bit more work to explain the extent of that being harm, I do think that this cuts against the opening government case, thus OO beats OG. Let's introduce closing government to the debate. So, the closing government extension starts off by explaining that what this might look like is an expansion of pre-existing private security firms. They say that basically because there are a variety of different segments of private security, you may have the police you may have city governments hire very different types of private security firms to tackle different types of crimes. They say that, for example, you may have one private security firm that focuses on general patrol and others that specialize in different areas of crime. You say that you would do this particularly to make sure that one, no one particular part of the police now has leverage over the city governments as a whole, and secondly, that this would be likely because it means that there's now competitive incentives for there to be new firms developing, and that this would, in general, decrease the price of policing. From here, closing government argues that one, you can just hire ethics committees to deal with the ethical issues. Two, that you would probably have lower wages because you would cut police unions to some extent, and also there would likely be fewer audits of the police under opposition side, that opposition side of the house probably has fewer audits of the police, meaning that we don't necessarily see the wasteful spending that exists, that you would probably have some level of auditing under closing government side of the house, and that this would lead to increased efficiency. First of all, because tender bidding would mean that you start having the most amount of net spend by an individual firm, but charging the government the least. Secondly, that you would probably have more red tape that is cut. And thirdly, that you would have more training that exists because you don't want to lose your contract, and that you could hire people who are on the edges of qualification and maybe hire more honorable people. Why does this fall out in the front half? The first set of considerations that I kind of run into here is that some of these things are verbatim what I get from opening governments, right? Opening government explicitly argues that because the private sector wants to be able to decrease costs, they're likely to be incredibly anti-union and thus would not allow for a police union to exist. Closing government argues that the exact same thing would happen. The extension to this from closing government is an argument about how audits may happen less, which while I can accept is new, it's not clear to me why it is that this is winning about this type of stuff. Additionally, opening government explicitly argues that under their side of the house, we would likely see companies carry the costs of paying for high expense police technologies because they would see that as a competitive advantage they would have when bidding for contracts with other governments. This is something I get out of the Prime Minister. Closing government's analysis about how the tender bidding process would likely lead to this happening is the exact same. Additionally, claims about how you're going to get better training in order to make sure that you don't lose your contract is also a claim that I get from the opening government, meaning that some of the key pillars of this closing government case are quite similar. The newest part of this is the stuff that comes in a minute, which is this claim about how you're going to have different segments of specializations. The problem that I have with this argumentation is that it's unclear to me its importance, right? It's not like, what I am missing is an explanation as to what it looks like to have a firm that is specialized on patrol and a firm that is specialized in, high risk, high stress police chases or something like that. What does that look like? Why do I care about this? Why are the police currently unable to do this? It is asserted to me that the police are bad at this, but I actually don't know if this is true. On face, I'm not sure that this is true. It's not clear to me that SWAT is inherently bad at its job when it comes to the high stress things. And sure, while I might personally be willing to casually accept that the police are bad at their job at patrol, it's not necessarily explained to me in a systematic way why is that this is true in a way that private policing necessarily fixes, right? And as I looked at the argumentation that surrounds while I can accept that there may be new firms that exist and this generally lowers the price, I'm not sure why I'm getting qualitatively better police services, right? I'm told that they are vaguely better, but I'm not sure to what extent. And I'm not sure why I care about the price going down, right? Yes, the city government is going to spend less money on the police, so I'm not told what they're going to do instead, right? What are they going to do with this cost savings? resources, right? Are they gonna keep it in the bank? Are they gonna lower taxes on the public? Are they gonna build more bridges? I don't know, right? So even if I accept that I get a lower price on police, which admittedly I still get some of the government, but even though I credit you guys for this argument, it's not going to impact this. Then there's like some superfluous stuff that I'm not sure of, right? I'm told that now more red tape is going to be cut. Even though I accept this claim is true, what's the benefit of this, right? What is the red tape that is too prohibitive? Why is it super prohibitive? Why does it need to be cut? Why is it that, for example, hiring people who are, like, there's multiple things that I'm almost even sure to some extent mutually contradict opposing governments, right? There's these cases about how, you can hire people who are on the fringes of qualification of joining the police services in status quo who currently don't get hired by the police, but on your side they do. But if in closing governments we also are casually accepting that the police are bad at their job, why would I want people who are not qualified enough for the police? In closing government, I further get a claim, which is that people who join the police are narcissistic, they may be marginally more narcissistic under opposition because of qualified immunity. But if your side is also arguing that they're not going to have pensions and are going to get paid worse, why would I want narcissists who are paid poorly, right? There's some claims about the quality of police that are going to come out that I find almost, I'm not going to say contradictory, but almost self-mitigating, right? It's not clear the extent of the impact that happens. So when I compare this to the front half, where I do note that there are missing mechanisms within the front half, the credit that I'm able to give closing government does create some new characterization of what this may look like. But the consequential outcomes that stem from this, I'm having a difficult time assessing the extent of their value in terms of the contribution to the debate. So when I compare this, for example, to opening opposition, who gives a clear explanation as to why it is that you may have differing public and government forces leading to some level of accountability on the police, this isn't directly engaged by closing government, meaning that it stands by contrast. I get a claim from opening opposition about how when these police are paid worse and don't have as much job security, they act worse. If closing government is going to concede this and argue that actually we may even lower the hiring standards that we have for the police, it almost seemingly strengthens opening opposition. It's not clear, at least through the analysis presented in CG, what this would do to opening opposition. When I compare this to the team in opening government, what I get from opening government is an explanation as to why it is that the abolishment of police unions may inadvertently end up with a decrease in qualified immunity and a decrease in the amount of blue shielding that we see happen, and as a result we may have more accountability, additionally because some of the low-level employees may get fired. Given that some of the claims that I get from closing governments are quite similar to that of opening government, it's difficult for me to assess the newness of the extension in contrast to opening government. And the stuff that I think is newer, right, the stuff on how it is that you may save money through competition and a variety of specializations, is not really impacted to me in such a way that I can intuit why it is that this is more beneficial than the case that I get from opening government, thus meaning it falls to opening government. Introducing closing opposition to the debate. What I get from closing opposition is a set of arguments that outlines that, first of all, the benefits of there being a centralized police is that it means that you are better able to equitably distribute resources throughout the city, right? That if you have locked contracts in your government side of the debate, you just might be inefficiently spending resources. Secondly, there's a claim which is that you may be able to do DEI and stuff like that on your CEO side of the house. And lastly, there's a claim about how if you do a good job creating safe neighborhoods, you have a better relationship within your community, but if you're basically hiring mercenaries, they don't really care about the civilians, and as a result, you treat them worse. I think that on their own, these claims are able to be quite compelling to me. The problem is that I think some of these claims are underexplored to a level that it makes it hard to credit. For example, the claim that you guys start off with about equitable distribution of resources throughout the city, I do think is interesting. While opening opposition does flag it, I also don't think opening opposition explores this to a level that I'm giving it much credit to. Closing opposition, I do think, has an opportunity to explain how, for example, if closing government's claim is how you're going to save a lot more money on the police, if the claim is, well, some city, we might have differing priorities about how we want to utilize the police, maybe we shouldn't hire a private company whose entire job is to defend 2-3 neighborhoods, who in 3 months we may not want their services there as much, but now we're locked into a contract and now we're wasting the money, could be an argument, but it's not necessarily made to the level that I can see where this is the most important consideration of the debate, why that leads to negative outcomes, this inability to accurately do resource budgeting and planning, right? It's kind of left with this idea that centralized planning leads to better distribution, which maybe to an extent I can accept on face, not fully, but I can see where we're going with it. But the extent of this being a huge benefit is a bit lost on it. Additionally, these claims about how you can have more control of the hiring process, again, it's interesting, but it feels like I'm doing a little bit of the work here when you guys are alluding to the idea that you can hire people from the community or hire people of different backgrounds. I can see where you're going with it, but again, Why is it that, for example, having more DEI or local police officers being hired is the ground-winning aspect? What is it about hiring people from a particular community or a particular background that even if everyone else in the debate is unclear about whether or not we're actually getting more or less accountability for the police, at the very least the fact that we have very strict or controlled hiring metrics for how we hire the police, why is that the winning factor? Why is it that we have such a high level of control over this? Isn't necessarily explored to, right? And then lastly, this idea on how we have a better relationship with the neighborhood, again, is kind of interesting, but explanation as to what it looks like to have a good relationship within the neighborhood. The explanation is that you are praised if you do a good job at this. Is kind of true, but it's not really clear to me why it is that city government-owned police officers have a particular incentive to do this, that private mercenaries wouldn't have an incentive to do. While I can think through why this is the case, it's not necessarily explained to me to the level that it's a clear gap in how it is that they treat people, that it's difficult for me to give this as much credit. So I think that what closing opposition needs to do is kind of pick one or two of these ideas and spend a lot more time going through each step as to how it is that these work within the round, so that way they can more clearly compare and contrast to the other teams. Because ultimately, I'm not really sure how I can adjudicate this idea of there possibly being better hiring standards or possibly being better distribution of resources in contrast to the much more solidified impacts that exist in the round, leading to, unfortunately, closing opposition fall. Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.